The political situation between US and China is not very stable. We might be rushing straight into a new Cold War. Our previous video on this topic went deeper into the geopolitics of it all. With the globalized world splitting into two influence spheres, how much economic power would each side wield? How much would military budgets grow, and who would rush ahead in the new arms race? Do you know about the Great China Firewall? It's already sort of an iron curtain, one that China raised itself, so Chinese users can't access a lot of Western websites. But with NordVPN, users can bypass that firewall when in China. NordVPN is sponsoring this video, and they're offering a great deal on their virtual private network, including 75% off a 3-year plan. NordVPN is an online security service that enables you to use the internet through encrypted virtual tunnels. Your own IP address is thus never visible to websites you visit. NordVPN has over 5,000 servers in 62 countries. You pick which country you'd like the server to be in. It's compatible with Windows, Mac OS, Android and iOS. Bandwidth use is unlimited and peer-to-peer sharing is allowed. Only NordVPN got all the green checks at PC Mag and was selected as the best VPN by VPN Mentor. Check out the 75% off a 3-year deal that NordVPN is offering by visiting the link in the description below and using the coupon code Binkov. You also get an additional month for free. Try it out. You have a 30-day money-back guarantee. The ongoing trade war between US and China is escalating before our eyes. Tariffs were just a start, and now technology and other political pressure is in play. So far, the imposed tariff resulted in little tangible gains for either side. As our last summer's video predicted, actual impact on GDP of either side is hard to quantify. Perhaps a bigger US goal was driving a wedge between companies working in China with China. Despite the often lambasted trade disbalance, US goal with the tariffs may not be to directly change the disbalance, but to pressure those companies indirectly through tariffs, in hopes some of them, or even a large number of them, would move out of China as it becomes too costly to work inside China, and thus not participate in Chinese economy and pay various taxes to China, making the Chinese economy stronger. While it is very questionable whether those companies would move out of China and move to US, as US would likely still be too expensive for them, it may be enough for the US political goals that the companies remain in third countries. As long as Chinese economy is hurt more than US economy, it may not matter to the US administration that the US economy is hurting as well. But in doing so, trade ties and supply chains around the world would get under pressure. And there are many parties of interest, various megacorporations and many states that don't want to see the boat rocked. Trade ties are something that did not have nearly as much influence back in 1950s. Japan, though traditionally a US ally, is very much tied to China economically, as it trades more with China than with US. It is impossible to conclude just how much would Japan be willing to lose in appeasing its US ally. And some of the countries that may look at China as the enemy, like Taiwan, may very well remain neutral and see how the wind blows. They are much more dependent on China economically and may simply conclude it is better not to pick sides until a real hot war makes it absolutely necessary. If we make up two blocks, one involving US and its immediate allies, and China with several of its closest allies, the GDP difference values of those two are much less than the difference between East and the West when Soviet Union was around. Two GDP sets could be used. Power purchasing parity is good at showing how large an economy is, how much the transactions are worth inside a country, and even how much trade is worth when two countries of similar cost of workforce are trading. But it falls short in globalized economy, where a rich country is trading with a poorer country. Nominal value GDP is useful as comparison in such cases. The list of countries when nominal value GDP is used is different. Less positive for China, though still not nearly as bad as situation was for Soviet Union decades ago. Ultimately, some middle-of-the-road value between those two GDP values would likely be most useful in comparing the economic influence of the two blocks. But perhaps more important would be strength of the neutral countries, which have, compared to the Cold War of decades ago, grew to be a much more decisive player. Europe in particular, with its strong nominal GDP values, might decide the outcome, depending on who manages to woo it. Though realistically, with the global economy supply chains, economic processes of a single company spread over numerous countries, oftentimes from two separate blocks, it is highly unlikely countries could be wooed as such. They would rather stay neutral, so the multinational companies could keep on chugging. And China is growing less dependent on exports, as the most of its GDP growth comes from internal consumption nowadays. Such an environment, if US doesn't manage to gather enough allies to sanction China or even stop trading with China, might eventually lead to China overtaking the US, even in nominal GDP value. But what does that really mean? Immediately, not much. China had the biggest economy during most of the 19th century, yet it lost decisive wars against the British Empire on home terrain and lost that position. USA overtook the British Empire in GDP in late 1800s, yet its preeminence as the world power was not an all-around accepted fact until sometime after the end of the First World War. Today's GDP is one thing, future GDP is another, but predicting economic growth decades into the future is a futile exercise. This current technology access and trade war is already changing the future growth projections. Financial crises are hard to predict, and currency exchange fluctuations can influence nominal GDP comparisons more than anything. Still, it seems fairly certain that short of a large crisis impacting just one of the two sides or a successful Iron Curtain rise around China, cutting it off from most of the world's trade, China will eventually match US nominal value GDP. Larger GDP means more money in the state pockets, funding a bigger defense budget. Current US defense spending is still quite a bit ahead of Chinese. But those figures don't include everything. Some nuclear research and space launch funds aren't included for the US, and no research and development nor foreign equipment purchases are included for China. With those included, Chinese spending rises a bit, but is still far away from US one. But the dollar won't buy the same value in China as it does in the US. Not only are soldier salaries smaller, but so are those of workers and researchers working on producing and developing new weapons. After that adjustment, Chinese funding does sharply rise, getting much closer to the US one. But what about the future? US is currently spending a greater percentage of its GDP on defense. In theory, China could try to match US spending as portion of GDP. If that happens, China might actually be spending more on its military than US, when power purchasing parity is taken into account. Of course, hiking up spending is not something that's easily done. If one does it within a few years, it would destabilize the economy, and certainly alert many other countries. US would get fearful and its military spending would rise, which in turn would make China rise its spending even more, and an arms race would commence in full gear. US may, however, be in a tough spot within a few decades, if China's economic rise continues. If US economy becomes the weaker one, no rise in spending would help keep pace with China, as Chinese would slowly but surely outmuscle whatever spending US could throw at them. That's also a dangerous point of no return, where various warmongering hawks may demand early action before such a point is reached. Of course, spending more today is not the same as having more today. US currently has a vast edge in ships, planes and other important equipment. For China to match those numbers, a few decades of bigger spending would be needed. Even the lists given don't tell the full story, as US ships are generally larger in displacement and more modern on average. Planes-wise, US fleet has on average larger fighters and bombers. Nuclear weapons are also an important factor in a Cold War, deterring the enemy. US has had a vast lead in that field, but for some decades now the US arsenal has not seen additions, while Chinese one has been steadily expanding. After the fall of the Soviet Union, US Air Forces did see a fall in procurement of new planes, enabling China to catch up in production rates, even though the base levels of their air forces are smaller. The ramp-up in F-35 production has, however, enabled US to once again start increasing its lead, especially since US is mostly procuring fifth-generation planes, while most of the Chinese procurement is made up of somewhat less modern types. There are already some projects of new combat planes under development for both sides, thus estimates to 2030s can be made. China certainly appears to be going all in on stealth aircraft. with a similar number of development projects as US. When it comes to Navy matters, Chinese ramp-up in production has been perhaps most evident. While the number of ships commissioned seems staggering, a good deal of them are rather small. Still, it's evident Chinese procurement of new ships has either caught up or overshot US procurement in most ship types, save for flat tops. Projection until 2024 is made here, as ships need years to be constructed and most of these are already contracted. Any estimate past 2025 is though very hard to make. The Chinese have it easier in the sense that their current base numbers are fairly low, so the procurement of planes and ships can more easily increase their overall arsenals in the coming decades. While the US base is already huge and the current procurement rates are barely enough to upkeep the numbers, as older planes and ships must get retired and replaced. But even so, making new equipment takes time, as does getting proficient in its usage at doctrinal level. Right now, unless military spending of either country sharply changes overnight, China isn't on course to match US military might in total numbers, weapon system versus weapon system, before 2040s at the earliest. Even then, China may not be able to control the Pacific, if US still has political access to all the bases in Japan. Then again, if US military goal is not merely preventing China from reaching into the Pacific, but being able to actively wage war over its coastline, parity in weapon systems is not needed for China. Even today, China has enough area denial power to dissuade US from offensive actions. Chinese lack of power projection tools, such as a vast fleet of strategic sea-lift ships, tanker aircraft or transport aircraft, is of little importance if Chinese are to control their own turf. Equally so, that lack of power projection is precisely what would make it very hard for China to perform offensive actions around Pacific, say Hawaii, in the next few decades. When it comes to the ground army, it's evident just how much US force is geared towards force projection. US Army and Marines force levels have stayed roughly the same for the last 20 years. Chinese have been decreasing their armed forces during the last 20 years, cutting 500,000 personnel. Most of it came from the ground army, as Marine Corps, Navy and Air Force generally increased in size. Another area where Chinese have caught up are spy satellites. The number of Chinese optical recon satellites may be a cause of concern for the US, if the additional satellites get launched at a similar pace to what was observed in the past. The weapons and numbers are not key though, as they've rarely been throughout history. It's the allies, the geographical position and the economy. And all those things get harder to predict as one attempts to go decades into the future. Even the geography might change, relatively speaking, if US loses some of its current bases on foreign soil, or if China gains some new bases. China is likely to expand its influence and try to protect its investment into the Belt and Road Infrastructure Initiative. If it does come to a hot war, those trade routes, especially the sea lanes, would get compromised, as US could cut off many of those shipping lanes. Impact on trade would be considerable, which is partly reason why China is investing so much in the land routes over Central Asia, reaching the European markets. Chinese dependence on oil has also oftentimes been cited as its Achilles heel. Indeed, even when domestic production and imports of oil via pipelines from Central Asian countries are excluded, some 6.5 million barrels of oil need to sail over the world's seas to reach China. That represents some 52% of all Chinese oil needs. When it comes to natural gas, some 26% of it has to sail over the seas. While shutting down most of that traffic would not immediately hurt the Chinese military, as there's more than enough resources to fuel the actual units as well as arms production factories, in the long run the Chinese economy would be very much under pressure. As the graph shows, even if some of the non-industrial use of resources, such as household use and personal transportation use, is curbed, the industry is bound to get hit. A dirty silver lining for China, though, is coal. China has been weaning itself from coal, which at one point met over 80% of its energy needs in an attempt to clean up its air. Its coal reserves are vast though, and if push comes to shove, China would need to reopen many of its old coal mines and try to redistribute the energy consumption for its industry. probably leaning towards nuclear energy and electricity, as well as buying extra gas and oil at higher prices from Russia and other Asian countries, thus shifting the global supply chains. Impact of such energy blockade, if attempted by US in a war, would be very visible on Chinese economy, but it may not be enough if US wants China to capitulate. Redistribution of production and consumption would be more likely, and after some years of readjustment, during which Chinese economy would lose a sizable chunk of its GDP, the US opponent would likely start rising again, slowly, thus postponing the clash for a few more decades, during which who knows what would various governments around the world do. Of course, such economic blockade would be tantamount to a declaration of war. It would hurt other countries too, as they want to trade with China, which is why US would not likely do it until after a hot war starts. Even then, performing a no-exception blockade would be hard on its alliance with other countries. It seems an arms race is already underway. What remains to be seen is how will the two world's biggest economies fare in the coming decades. Who will come out on top? And will the race end in peace, or is the humankind destined to repeat its mistakes? And remember, Binkov may talk about hypothetical wars, but only real peace can bring us all together.